if you're interested in getting into classic sci-fi, seeing the roots of science fiction, I'm going to suggest 15-ish books you might read to get you going on that. And I've done a similar video on fantasy. And basically, I define classic. Usually, classic is an age. It's a time marker. 40 years older or more, roughly. There may be exceptions, very slightly within a year or two. And basically, I think this is a good enough period to kind of separate and divide out, like, okay, stuff gets very popular when it comes out, and so maybe for some years, it then submerges and then re-emerges. You see this in all kinds of areas of life, actually. But just take booktube and books, which is what we're talking about, right? You'll see people now, I see people getting into books from the 70s and the 80s and the early 90s now, being like, wow, I hadn't really heard of this. And actually, you're like, oh, if you look at the awards from the time, and if you look at the buzz from the time, some of these books were quite important. Some of these authors were quite important. But they've just been forgotten, really, in popular book reading circles. So yeah, 40 years or more, stood the test of time. Now, sci-fi and fantasy are slightly different. Fantasy, as we really experience and understand it now, so much of it is influenced by the publication of The Lord of the Rings. Not only that, there are lots of things going on in fantasy too, and it has history well before Lord of the Rings that influences Tolkien. But so much of what we think about is, it's a centrifugal force really coming from him. And in sci-fi, you have much more diverse roots of modern science fiction and what we understand by science fiction. There is not one long shadow over science fiction. And so, yeah, what I'm going to do is we'll go through these, and there's not a specific order. I've picked which one I want to start with, and then we'll go on. I will say there's a couple, there's some people I haven't included at all in this list who you might pick up on. It doesn't mean they're bad, just that I haven't included a book from them, despite the fact that maybe you like them. I mean, there's people like Frederick Pohl or Larry Niven, great classic sci-fi writers, no books mentioned here, and it's basically because I think they're just a step below a lot of the authors, a lot of the books here. I will give some honourable mentions before the final entrance or entry or something like that, just to kind of say, look, here's some other names, and there are reasons you might exclude them from this kind of list. But yeah, let's start. As I say, this is not a worst to best. This is just 15 recommendations. John Carter of Mars by Edgar Rice Burroughs. This, I think, is, in fact, it's a singular place to start. It's not the only place to start, but as the singular place to start is a good one. Princess of Mars is the first novel, so if I'm just recommending one, it's going to be that. Gods of Mars is the second. They're short. In this edition, they're 174 pages, 290 pages, 136 pages. The first three novels, those are the lengths of, and that's on fairly ordinary, font and designer page and stuff. So I think you could reasonably read a couple of them if you want to get into it. But one great thing about classic sci-fi particularly is that there's lots of short books. You can just read a book that's 200 pages, it's good, or it's bad, you don't like it, move on. I think what John Carter of Mars and other books by Burroughs, Tarzan and Pellucidar and Carson and Venus are the three other, and they all interlink, by the way. This is an early shared universe, but these early books give us is, I think, a lot of the invention of adventure sci-fi. It's where Sword and Planet starts for us, really. Maybe slightly drawing on kind of both proto-scientific investigation of the planets, but also of Jules Verne and stuff like that. But that kind of adventure sci-fi. But I think this is where our modern conception of adventure sci-fi comes from, really, is John Carter, who is a strapping heroic hero who jumps around on Mars because the gravity's lower. And he's very heroic and brave, and he's constantly getting into scrapes, and the action is non-stop. Each chapter is dealing with several different incidences that are very exciting. This is going to be highly entertaining. It gives you access to tropes and ideas. And one thing, we can trick ourselves into thinking, oh, well, this is very boring and cliched. Well, of course, actually, we're reading the thing that is the trope, is where it comes from. So yeah, I think this is not a bad place to start at all. Great. There's some really strong characters, really strong imagination, and there is a bit of hardly academic, but still pretty good, reflections on the situations he's setting up. There is actually a degree of depth here, which is probably neglected. So, John Carter of Mars, Princess of Mars by Edgar Rice Burroughs. Another early-ish important figure here. I've got three here technically. The Foundation trilogy by Isaac Asimov. That is Foundation, Foundation and Empire, and Second Foundation. There is a second Foundation trilogy, Prelude to Foundation, Foundation and Earth, and Foundation and the Edge, or something like Edge of the Foundation, something like that. But yeah, Asimov, also important for iRobot. Asimov represents in this list really early, good quality, hard sci-fi, which isn't always, can be very much about like a specific technology and loads of detail, like, oh, this is how it works, these are the effects. But it can be more high concept and conceptual as well. As in this case, it's, oh, what if, you perfected a sociological science essentially of predicting the future. And so Harry Seldon is a statistician who shapes the course of the universe by saying, look, these things are going to happen, and so we need to prepare and deal with them in certain ways. And so the Foundation and the Second Foundation are set up. So two foundations were set up at opposite ends of the universe. Of the second, nothing can be told. It guards the secrets of psychohistory. Foundation, the first book, is the story of the first foundation on the remote secrets of Terminus from which those secrets were withheld. So yes, it is an exceptionally kind of imaginative and in that sense enjoyable series. I think there's an Apple TV series of it going on, adaptation at the moment. It's something you'll run into, and with Asimov and with Clarke and some of these other writers of that type, is a fairly dry, precise writing style, which isn't everyone's taste. They're still quick books, though. This is one of the things, is that you're reading a really good book, a really interesting book in 220 pages for that first one. And I think Foundation is a really great piece of work in terms of imaginative future history based on a kind of conceptual point of what would happen if this was the case. If this one thing changed or this one technology was available, what would happen? And Asimov does that excellently well. And there's plenty of other Asimov out there if you enjoy it. Okay, next on the pile, the arbitrary pile, the original Hammers Slammers collection by David Drake, which the shorter version, which I think just excludes the novella, the final novella in this, The Tank Lords, was published in 1979. The core stories now are all from the 70s. And this actually also has an introduction by Jerry Pournelle, which is interesting. There we go. You can see it's got a tank on it. And what do we have? Yeah, basically, these are short stories. This particular one. This was the first Hammer Slammers I read, which included the Tank Lords. I love David Drake. He died. Was it earlier this year or very late last year? The Tank Lords is a good addition, but the core collection is all you need, really. And it is by an ex-soldier. David Drake had served in Vietnam in the Black Horse Cavalry, and it is about a mercenary outfit led by Colonel Alois Hammer, who go around in their super tanks of the future, along with other technologies. And there is a really interesting... Drake is a good writer, that's one thing, his style is good, but he certainly has kind of got the improved technique of that post-1960s New Wave period. So the stories tell all kinds of stories, basically. That, you've got stuff about like, oh, what happens when there are some other aliens out there in the universe. It's mostly humans, and the humans hire the Slammers and other military units. Mercenaries are a significant part of intergalactic warfare for various reasons, and there's non-fiction, inverted commas, articles in here talking about why he hasn't there in-world non-fiction. But you get stuff like alien contact, you get stuff like guerrilla warfare, you get stuff to do with people's first missions, and it's got a really brilliant combination of like, okay, so war is horrendous and bloody, but there is this fellowship that comes out of it, and there is a certain excitement that comes out of it, and a big strength for Drake is giving you a sense of these worlds and these kind of situations, these strategic situations, and giving a lot of character to these situations and the dramas, and probably because he based a lot of them on history he's read or poems he's read, ancient poetry, things like that, taking cues from myth and legend about what kind of what kind of dramatic situation there could be. And so that's it's a really good place to get into military sci-fi. There are another couple of military sci-fi ones on this list, so we'll compare a bit as we go, but this is a really good place to start with military sci-fi. It is, for me, basically where I started. Let's go for this one next, just for a variety. Lord of Light by Roger Zelazny. I'll read the back. A distant world where gods walk as men but wield vast and hidden powers. Are they truly immortal? Who are these gods who rule the destiny of a teeming world? Their names include Brahma, Kali, Krishna, and also he who was called Buddha, the Lord of Light, but who now prefers to be known simply as Sam. How has the colonization of another planet become a reenactment of Eastern religion and mythology? Zelazny is a fascinating and brilliant writer, I think. And I recommended him, I think, in my 15 classic fantasy books. This is a 70s book, I believe. Maybe late 60s. Yeah, 1967. And, in fact, this Sci-Fi Masterworks one does have a afterword by George R.R. Martin, interestingly. I forget what he says. But yeah, it's funny. But it's not a funny book, it's not a comedy book, it's actually quite a dramatic, pathos-laden book, but it's just an incredibly engaging, good-humoured, imaginative exercise. Here, a shift you see from the kind of 40s and 50s into the 60s, from that era, particularly with the high tide you might think of as in the 50s, into the early 60s, is a lot of kind of like, here's this technological situation we're really going to investigate, this really complicated kind of, not necessarily, actually, it may not be complicated, but potentially very complicated technology or technological idea, or this big thing has changed in our speculative future, what would happen? And the new wave introduces, a generally speaking, a greater desire to write well, to write stylishly, and two, and that doesn't always have value, but often it does, but also this idea that the concepts you can investigate can be a bit more numinous or fuzzy, or less about, there can be a technology that's important, but the technology should also be driving character stakes, moral stakes, things like that. Which is not, by moral stakes I mean something slightly different to just the guy, the author tells you about morality. That happens essentially inevitably, doesn't it, in whatever you're reading. But rather that the technology's moral implications are heavily investigated and problematized. This is, that kind of stuff. This is a sci-fi book. It's about a human colony world, but apparently it's Hindu mythology is real colony world. It might make you think, especially with the date of the original series of Star Trek in some of those episodes. I don't know if that's a direct influence, but it's one of my favourite sci-fi novels, and I probably one of my favourite sci-fi fantasy novels, so I highly recommend that. We'll go for another, technically Sword and Planet, but this is an interesting bump in the road of sci-fi. Ray Bradbury is, generally speaking, a bump in the road for sci-fi and fantasy. He zags when you think he's going to zig. He wrote genre pieces that were not really very close to the genre they were technically in. He constantly did this. Fahrenheit 451 is also sci-fi by him, which I'd also recommend, but is... and is actually about the purest sci-fi by him, but is still, barely recognisable. There's virtually no kind of real science fiction in it. That's not the kind of book it is. And the same when you look at his fantasy. His fantasy, often the fantasy is incredibly lightly held. The Martian Chronicles is a book about humans going to Mars, the story of humanity's repeated attempts to colonise the Red Planet. The first member few, most succumbed to a disease called the Great Loneliness when they saw their home planet dwindle to the size of a fist. Those few who survived found no welcome on Mars. But more rockets arrived from Earth and more. People brought their old prejudices with them and their desires and fantasies and tainted dreams. And there's the hint, by the way, that this is really more of a book about fantasy and dream, but with the idea of the emerging space frontier of the 40s and 50s. Rocket technology being invented in the 40s, and I suppose all the way back to 19th century, the advances of 19th century astronomy. 1951 is the collection of these. These were short stories and stuff like that. Some expanded, some added. And yeah, Martian Chronicles, I don't think it's my favourite Bradbury, but it might be. And I've read quite a bit of Bradbury at this point, you know, good 7 or 8 books or something. So yeah, Martian Chronicles is a really beautiful, touching, moving book that plays with tropes you've got elsewhere in this selection to do with Sword and Planet particularly, and the emerging frontier of space, which also Lord of Light is dealing with. Let's go for Canticle for Leibowitz next. That's the next on the pile anyway. Walter M. Miller. This is basically the world's ended. There was a nuclear holocaust, the flame deluge, and there is a medieval world in the ruins, rebuilding slowly. And it turns out, I mean, it's cast on the back kind of as a gag novel, which is a weird one, by the way. But it's not unfair as to the thing it draws, which is that basically this, in the start, a monk finds a handwritten document from the Blessed Saint Leibowitz that reads, "Pound pastrami, canned kraut, 6 bagels, bring home for Emma. Could this holiest of relics hold the key to humanity's salvation?" It is a... So that bit of it, you're like, okay, that's funny. And there is this degree of like this humour in the first story, perhaps, a tiny bit elsewhere, but really most in the first of these 3 linked novellas that are set over, you know, a great period of time, hundreds of years in the future. And it calls itself a sharp satirical examination of humanity. There's chilling, provocative and endlessly imaginative. Again, in the same way that casting it as humorous is misguided, calling it as satire, or even chilling, I'm not sure. I think maybe I see more of that. It is a hard book to explain without spoiling some things, but basically it's this kind of picture of humanity developing again, rebuilding again, and the tensions between order and progress, and a love for knowledge and a use of knowledge, and what wisdom is in using knowledge, and is it inevitable that humanity repeats its mistakes? Or can it learn from its mistakes? What does learning look like? What are good and what are bad uses of technology? There are some coruscating passages which I've heard some reviews that you can just tell that people are do not vibe with or do not get, and this, you know, you're always going to get that with an author, aren't you? There's some stuff you'll get and like some bits you won't. But because Miller has this very distinctive and powerful view of the world and of humanity and of meaning, and it is. I'm not just one of my favourite classic sci-fi novels, one of my favourite novels of all time. Again, much as with Lord of the Light, it's very high. I would definitely say that this is from the 50s. He basically didn't write again, Miller. He left an unfinished draft of something else when he died, basically. Or as he's dying, it's published. I'm not sure which way around it was exactly. But yeah, it's this one-off masterpiece, you know, one and done. He didn't need to do anything else. And there are very few entries in the whole canon of science fiction that investigate humanity and the nature of human society as keenly as this. Another military sci-fi, just next on the pile, The Forever War by Joe Haldeman. This is a really interesting concept. So it's very much new wave sci-fi in the way I've described, in the way that, and in a way that Hammerstein has learned stylistically from that. It's slightly less self-consciously so. Haldeman has a concept. Okay, what happens? You know, you travel, and because of relativity and light speed and stuff like that, everyone else is aging quick. While you're going at light speed, you're aging slower. Time is passing more slowly. That's the gimmick, which means that as this war goes on with this unconquerable alien enemy, William Mandela, the hero, the kind of narrator, he is aging much slower than the world around him. So, you know, it means that people are dying, you know, centuries have passed, potentially between tours of duty. And that's an effective gimmick. And that is a hard sci-fi gimmick, but the kind of new wavy twist is basically, this is a Vietnam era. Haldeman was a soldier. He won the Purple Heart in Vietnam. This is him in 1974, he publishes it, and this is him working out, I think just trying to chew out the real impact of war on him in a quite explicit way. Hammer Slammers, as David Drake, he later says, maybe doing psychotherapy for free without realising it by writing. But for Haldeman, this is very conscious, and it is essentially anti-war, and it is it has this clever connection between the effects of war on people and the futilities of war, and this separating, isolating effect of age, of the fact you don't age, basically. So yes, no, it's so in that sense, yeah, that's kind of what I mean by this new wave deepening of the reflection on the concept. And The Forever War is a very good example of that, and very readable. Like, it's not kind of like, oh, it's so artsy. It's just very easy to read. Also easy to read, but definitely on the artsy side, let's say, The Fifth Head of Cerberus by Gene Wolfe. This is where I'd recommend, I think, probably people start with Gene Wolfe. If you're interested in Gene Wolfe, there's lots of videos on this channel. Other books to start with would be Peace, Book of the New Sun, Wizard Knight. There are Book of the Long Sun. There are many places to start, but he's a complex author. This is the first Wolfe I read. I didn't read any Wolfe after that for many years, but I really liked this book. I was like, oh, wow, that was a great book. Basically, it is 3 novellas from different perspectives, and with different narrative techniques. So, very, in that sense, modern, written in the 70s. And it was also the announcement of Wolfe's arrival as a serious contender. And Wolfe is the sci-fi fantasy writer's writer. He is, I think, generally considered, by his peers, one of their kings. He died in 2019, I think. Truly great writer. Yeah, 2019. Truly great writer. And underappreciated because there is a density of technique and imagination, which is just a lot to handle. There's a lot there. But yeah, Fifth Head of Cerberus is more approachable than many Wolves. But it's also, I think, important in sci-fi terms. It's 70s, it's very much classic, because it gives us a kind of a literary approach to sci-fi, which is at a different angle to, say, Haldeman's writing Forever War and being like, oh, what if we parallel these two things, kind of the hard sci-fi concept of relative aging and the alienation that war brings to the soldier from human society. And the way in which the war itself seems to be this kind of impersonal hard sci-fi concept almost that just happens and is weird and pointless and crazy. Here, that's very much literary. Here, the literary thing is to do with the narrator and technique and structure. And anyone who's read, in terms of very popular sci-fi fantasy, it's a hybrid, I guess, book, The Broken Earth. You got a similar thing there. I'm thinking about The Broken Earth specifically. The idea of the use of narrator though they're doing different things, to communicate the story and the subtext of the story and the sci-fi world all quite seriously. And there is definitely a sci-fi world here. This is a sci-fi novel. It definitely is interested in particular technologies and particular experiences, the nature of... but uses these, in terms of its conceptual density, to reflect on humanity. So cloning, shape-shifting aliens, colonization, slavery. All these are put together in terms of pictures of what genetic engineering and things connected to that. All of these are kind of used as mirrors to consider humanity in what is also essentially just a very entertaining and beautifully written book. One of my favourite Wolfe books. Weirdly, I think the only British writer on this list, I think, they will talk about the on-mention, we'll get some more in the on-mention section. But Ian M. Banks, The Player of Games, which is the second or I think it's the third culture book originally. And this one, I think I might be cheating on the date slightly, 1988. So this is 36 years old. It is not as old as the others. But I did this, I think, with sci-fi. I included one. Oh, sorry, fantasy. I included one that was very slightly, newer than 40 years old. Banks, The Culture is a great series. I have several videos on it, but particularly why you should read it. But The Player of Games is, rightly I think, often recommended as a really good introduction. I've actually reviewed another really good introduction, Use of Weapons, on the channel. Basically these are quite dense, intelligent, easy to read in terms of style, but all cylinders going kind of stories of imagination about this universal mega society which is incredibly advanced and is beyond scarcity. I did have a recent discussion with a constructive commenter saying, "Oh, is that?" Because I would call that, there's a space communism trope there. I'd call it, you see it in Star Trek the original series and somewhat TMG, and you see it in The Culture. The idea that we're going to get to this post-scarcity thing, we'll sort all of it out, and then human behaviour will change drastically. Essentially, is the big thing. And Banks pushes into that, but he does it with a lot of nuance. Like, there are costs to this, and there are ways that this works, and there are ways that it fails. And he gives us often the perspective of the losers and even villains, by that I mean opponents of the culture. Fascinatingly, he is an incredibly, for someone who might think is an ideologue, has very ideological opinions, like every great writer who has an ideology, and no writer lacks one. Sorry, Martin Amis, but no great writer lacks one. But the great writer knows how to sublimate his own ideology into the understanding of the other as well. And Banks is great at that. And The Player of Games does an interesting thing of dumping a citizen, one of its best great game players, Jernau Morat Gerge, the Player of Games, famous, basically master of every board, computer and strategy game. Basically he is the top poker player. And he goes to the Empire of Azad, cruel and incredibly wealthy, to try their fabulous game. A game so complex, so like life itself, that when it becomes emperor, mocked, blackmailed, almost murdered, Gurgi accepts the game, and with it the challenge of his life, and very possibly his death. And yeah, I would say that this is shortish for a culture book. This and Use of Weapons, this is 300 pages. This and Use of Weapons are 300-ish pages. Several others are like 700 or 600. So they are, and the first book published, Consider Phlebas, is good, but not great. And it's also much longer than this. It's nearly 600 pages, I think. So I'd say this is a good place to start for the culture, but also for a certain kind of like a modern hard sci-fi. The idea that there are certain technological concepts, and he puts lots in. Every book has a technological or sociological concept he wants to explore, and he uses that, to explore his quite tripped out, interesting, weirdo characters. He uses it to investigate the concept itself and the cost of the concept. A big thing, as I say, being the culture is magnificent and wonderful, but so much of the action is happening out on the fringe where the culture has to deal with other weird, difficult situations, and it does stuff that a techno-utopia wouldn't do in its own boundaries. So yeah, The Player of Games, Ian M. Banks. Okay, I'll give you a choice here. This is a joint entry because essentially the Vorkosigan Saga by Lois McMaster Bujold, you can enter at two places, really. You can kind of enter at other places, but I'd say really you can enter at Shards of Honor or The Warrior's Apprentice. And that's because there's a generational thing going on, that you have two books that happen in one generational period to do with characters called Cordelia and Errol. And then most of the books then happen in the next generational, and that then spans 20 years in world. To this point, there may not be any more. At this point, Bujold is retired and writing the things she wants, and she's mostly writing some stuff about Penric and Desdemona in her fantasy universe. But yeah, it's a big series, relatively. I'm not enormous, but it's got 16 books, something like that. I think it's 16, including a collection of novellas called Boars of Infinity. 17, if I've either 16 or 17, and it is, it's certainly in my top couple of sci-fi series. It's hard to know exactly where it'd rank, but it's something I've read a lot of. I've read like 11 or 12 of those 16, 12 maybe of them, and enjoyed them all. There is a clever thing Bujold does in the Vorkosigan books, where she always has it's high sci-fi in the specific sense. There's always a technology, or there's always a a sociological event that's happening, which she wants to use to interrogate our society and what's going on. She's good at that. That's something she's very interested in. But it's not because she's so big into the tech. In terms of hard sci-fi, it's hard sci-fi conceptually, but not in practice. In practice, it turns into a way, of her characters and the world. Her characters and the world are great, and the concepts are ways of exploring those. It's space opera-ish, saga-ish. It is often very funny. Miles Vorkosigan, who's the hero of just over half the books, I think, is an incredibly funny, entertaining character. I'm really glad people have rediscovered Bujold. I got into Bujold, I think, because I actually read her fantasy first, but because I was just like, I will just read like 10 years of Hugo winners or something. Many years ago I thought that, and so I read, I think Paladin of Souls won the Hugo, but I was like, I'll get one before that, Curse of Chalion. And then she's actually the along with Heinlein, like the most... the biggest winner, basically, or biggest nominee / winner in Hugo history. There's a N.K. Jemisin fails that slightly with the trilogy win, 3 on 3 wins on 3 nominations. But yeah, you've basically got the most one of the most important Hugo nominees ever for what the Hugos are worth, and nowadays there are obviously questions about that. But back in the day, certainly not. And I'm a great fan of Bujold. I think her rediscovery is great. These ones are from, I think her first book's about 84, 85, 86 or something. Shards of Honor is 86. And Warrior's Apprentice, also 86. So slightly cheating on those. She wrote them in the very early 80s. They're like 82, 83. So I will give myself the pass on those. These include Barry Yar in this one and the Vor game in this one, which I think both won the Hugo. I believe those two won the Hugo. So yes, the Vorkosigan Saga. Start with the Warrior's Apprentice or with the Shards of Honor. Penultimately, this is a lovely book. I also like this edition. Like, it's a little pulp edition of The Sword of Rhiannon by Lee Brackett, who contributed to The Empire Strikes Back many years later. 128 pages. Sword and Planet, Mars, a million years ago. Mars, planet of science lords and man monsters. Mars, world of mystery and marvels. Into this lost world plunged Matt Kars, explorer of interplanetary ruins, to find himself inhabiting the body of a mythical god and slated to fight that immortal's battle all over again. This time with the knowledge of Earth's unborn future as his sole scientific secret. This is Lee Brackett, has many short stories, other novels as well, very entertaining writer. One of the great early queens of genre fiction, along with C.L. Moore. A thing about Brackett that I like is there's a few things. Basically, there is an actual depth of imaginative and moral vision, which is often lacking from pulp sci-fi fantasy, even by good writers. This is, as I say, it's science fiction, and it's a weird one because it's time travel science fiction, but he's on Mars in the future, but he goes back to Mars in its past. And so Mars is a water planet, rivers of Mars, and he, there he is, great. So in that case, is it just kind of fantasy or something? But no, it's got time travel in it, okay, fair enough. But also, it's got this kind of like, okay, science is going to help me win this. So it's this kind of engagement of a scientific concept, a set of scientific concepts, the space frontier and the in time travel and things like that, with the idea of the cultural inheritance of the human being, the human advantage, but combined with this slightly gonzo, pulpy, fantasy-ish plot. And I think it's not, Brackett does other stuff too, in terms of she'll do harder sci-fi, but she's often doing this kind of hybridization, not of actual content, it's all sci-fi in the sense we typically use that word, but it's stylistically, content-wise, it's just got all this other stuff going on. And it's definitely got it's got a good, and I said this about C.L. Moore as well. Northwest of Earth has this kind of noir vibe. Maybe this is less noir, but it certainly has this influence by other forms of pulp fiction, including detective fiction. It's got this distinct style, kind of cool, fun voice. It's action-packed, it's short, it's easy, and it is a very good book. So that's Sword of Rhiannon. I think it has another name, but I forget what it is, but by Lee Brackett. Some honourable mentions before I give the last. The last is not the best, it's just the last on the list. Honourable mentions, which I have not given any examples of, but so H.G. Wells, John Wyndham, Arthur C. Clarke, Philip K. Dick, C.S. Lewis. Those are 5 authors whose sci-fi I greatly enjoy. As I say, there's some sci-fi authors whose sci-fi I've really enjoyed, but I haven't greatly enjoyed, let's say. But these are guys who I would say, these all wrote 40 years ago or more. Sword of Rhiannon is late 40s, early 50s, for the relevance of our discussion about that. Do you know what? I've actually got 2 more, and I think I've just put one somewhere else. I don't know where I put it. I will pick up another book and pretend it's that in a minute. So yeah, we've got 2 more actually, but honourable mentions. I'd say Wells, H.G. Wells, endlessly imaginative. Island of Dr. Moreau, Invisible Man, Time Machine, and War of the Worlds. Big 4, quartet you could read just to get a ton of ideas. And there's many other books by him as well. Very entertaining author. And occasionally there's a bit of depth and interest, like I think the psychology and the experiences of the time traveler in the Time Machine are really interesting, as far as just like, that's a cool, you come up with something cool there, but you're not going to show us and tell us at all. There is literary art in it, but basically a lot of the time they are marginally literary art. They are kind of stuck, they have some trappings and flirtations with literary art, but they're not really literature. They are purely imaginative exercise. Wyndham, my experience of Wyndham, and I should read more Wyndham, but I've read like 3 Wyndham books or something, is maybe similar. That Wyndham is very entertaining pulp with good imagination, and never tedious, and so yeah, like Wells, great for diving into at that level, but perhaps never for me transcended that. And there's nothing wrong with just being imaginative, but yeah. Arthur C. Clarke is a weird one. I've not actually read loads of Clarke. I've read a bunch of the Rama books, some of which with Gentry Lee and are very different, but Rendezvous with Rama is very fun, but very interesting, very clever, finding a Dyson sphere, investigating what's going on with it. What's the mystery of this strange device that's appeared in our system with apparently no one on it. I'd say, like Foundation, Rendezvous with Rama is a little bit dry, but it's probably, I think for that one I just wanted to pick one of that kind of book for the list. Weirdly though, with Rama, because he then starts co-writing them with Gentry Lee, who's obviously doing the main writing over a concept, suddenly there are these really big kind of character dramas, which is nothing like the first book at all. They are decent but not amazing. Philip K. Dick, I think, is fascinating and strange, and I would certainly recommend you read him, but I would also caveat emptor that Philip K. Dick is a strange author, basically. Not necessarily hard to read, but just oddball conceptually. If you compare Blade Runner, the adaptation of To Android's Dream of Electric Sheep, you realise that or if you read his How to Build a World That Doesn't Fall Apart in 60 Minutes, whatever it's called, you realise that Dick is just a bit crazy, and I think they are harder sells for that. You notice the adaptations do very odd things with them to make them normal dramas. And C.S. Lewis, the Planet Trilogy, maybe it's my favourite sci-fi of all, but how far it's sci-fi in a way that's recognisable to the average punter is debatable. How far it's not even fantasy really, though it might have fantastic and indeed science fictional elements. It's just this other thing, and definitely it starts. I'd say Out of the Silent Planet and Perelandra both have a lot of their sword and planet fiction. They have a lot of science fictional elements. That Hades Strength, which I think is the best of them, ends up in a very different place and is just its own thing, and breaks genre altogether, I think. So I haven't included Lewis. I actually realised I've been talking rubbish about things I was finished. I just put books in a different place. I have several more. Let's do them. Let's pretend this is Starship Troopers. We'll do that next. Starship Troopers by Heinlein. Robert Heinlein is military sci-fi. It is a different kind of military sci-fi from either Hammer Slammers or Forever War. It is again by a guy who had served in the military for many years, though had not seen, I think, very serious combat, had been engaged on, but had served in pretty serious circumstances. Heinlein, there are controversies about it, which I won't discuss here. I don't think they're particularly serious, they're not substantive controversies, bluntly. But I think what's effective and powerful about it is that it is a morally serious view and attempt to handle what the author sees as the inevitability of war and bloodshed, the experience of actually being in the army, which is something which I'd say Haldeman does a bit, Drake does a bit more, but he's interested in it. He gives real descriptions, detailed and not varnishing the truth, particularly depictions of basic training, of warfare. Is nothing like the film from the 90s or the very good cartoon series that followed up from that. So I'd say Heinlein Starship Troopers is also compulsorily readable. It's just very easy to read. 270 pages. You can bang it out in a day or two. I did. Heinlein, very good. Yes, let's go for this next. Neuromancer by William Gibson. Gibson, this is basically cyberpunk's origin, and really cyberpunk, my general impression is cyberpunk is really good for between this and Snow Crash. I've read more than one person say that, and I haven't read anything beyond that. I'd like to read some other stuff that's in that techno dystopia, dystopia inverted commas, area. I'll probably be reading Altered Carbon this year, which is a sort of somewhere in the same region. Neuromancer is a really fun, stylish depiction of sort of this guy, and this is it 84? 1984, yeah, so 40 years old, definitely qualifies. This Starship Troopers is 1958. This one is a just very stylish and imaginative depiction of a kind of corporate and highly technologically driven society, electronic technology, social technology, and the way in which people are hooked into that, the way in which people engage, the way in which this may or may not degrade society. It's not clear, the chicken or the egg, but combined with just incredible imagination, great action, and some really good kind of depictions or visualizations of human interaction, kind of immersive reality kind of interaction with the computer world. Neuromancer, definitely highly recommend. Our last two that I actually have here are for many people they are going to be the number 1 and 2, so they are a useful place to end. That's why I think they're in a slightly different pile, because they were bigger books. This is the Complete Tales of H.P. Lovecraft. Lovecraft is cosmic horror chiefly, and he is genre breaking in the sense that his cosmic horror is about creatures where the point is not really how they biologically work, what's the science fiction concept, but just there are things we can't understand out in the universe, and that makes us tiny and insignificant, and that's terrifying. The sort of, I guess, an end point of a certain materialistic view of the universe. He also has some stuff that is in the same shared universe as that, which is fantasy, his Dreamworld stuff, which I also highly recommend. But yeah, I'd say Lovecraft is, though there are certain tics you have to handle, there are certain things that you may or may not like in his stories, he is incredibly adept. One, he's great at kind of creating creepy, unpleasant situations, coming up with strong archetypal fears of the human race. He's incredibly imaginative in that way, and good at depicting it. There's cliches and jokes about his style, but his style certainly is immersive for that. I would say if you want a single story, see if you like it. Probably something that's short, something like Colour Out of Space is quite short, and I think it is often seen as a good introduction for it. Slightly longer, The Call of Cthulhu itself is not at all hard to read. or Pickman's Model, which is actually shorter. Those are all very good introductory stories for different things going on in his, like the contact with the alien and the unusual and the dark within us. I think they're all good places to go. If you want something longer, Mountains of Madness, Beyond the Mountains of Madness is probably the best of his longer mythos stories, though there are many good longer mythos stories. And if you are interested in the Dreamland stuff, which I mentioned here, because I don't think I did in the fancy stuff, which it is fancy, but it connects in. Cats of Ulthar is a very short and entertaining entry into it, which you probably get a decent idea of it. Nyarlathotep is also short and interesting for that. And then the Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath is his long, novella length or whatever, big story of that universe, which I think is very, very good. So H.P. Lovecraft, in general, his mythos and his Dreamland stories. But let's say The Colour Out of Space. Finally, Dune. I'm mentioning being the first book, not the whole trilogy. I'll comment on that momentarily. But Dune is great and well known for a reason. Dune does not cast the shadow that Lord of the Rings does. I mentioned that at the very outset, that there is no sci-fi equivalent of Lord of the Rings. But Dune is, in a lot of ways, in terms of the imaginative capture and scope of Lord of the Rings in sci-fi, is Dune. Now, actually, even there, like Lord of the Rings is such a singular achievement. It's not, Dune does not compare in that way, but there is something about the grandeur and scope and imagination and capturing up of different things and depiction of a universe and a world and the characters in that world, which is so masterly. There are things that get said about Dune that I don't think are basically fair. I think they're like, oh, it's really badly written. This is a bit like the Lord of the Rings is badly written. I think these are crazy opinions. I can't discuss that here. But those things are not substantive. You might not like it or its style. I can't vouch for that. But the old Latin about degustere. But the point is that it's so good. It is so rich and so many ideas and so many things it wants to handle to do with conservation and human destiny and the human psyche and how we individuals are caught up in these great movements that happen around us that we don't seem to be able to control. And the kind of, oh, by the way, I've imagined all these crazy things that are in this universe and the way it works and why it works like it works and why you can't just shoot everyone. Well, they've got shields. If things go too fast, it bounces off the shield. Loads of great ideas, depiction of culture, very strong, whether it is of the Harkonnens or of the Fremen or whoever else. A hero, whatever people say, but a heroic figure in Paul Atreides, genuinely heroic in both the Greek and the modern sense of those terms, I think, in the first book. As to the rest of the Frank Herbert books, the other 5, I think if you like Dune and like it enough that you don't care specifically about its plot contents, you're like, I'd like to read more in this universe. God Emperor of Dune, Dune Messiah, the second one. God Emperor is the 4th, isn't it? Dune Messiah, the second book, is short. It's really an extended coda to Dune and is well worth reading. As long as you're not so attached to just like, I just want more of exactly the same, but you want something that is closely related. If you're then like, and I'd say that if that's where you're at, just stop there after that. If you're like, I want more, Children of Dune is very highly rated. And then the second Dune trilogy, there would have been a 7th book to finish it off, but the second trilogy, as it exists, which is God Emperor, Chapter House, and something else. I'll check whilst I'm waffling. They are all God Emperor Heretics. That's it. Heretics of Dune. They're all well rated to some degree, but I think there's a tiering that Dune is very widely accessible. God Emperor is closely related to it, and Children is a natural extension of it, and it's the real sequel of those first two combined. The second trilogy is Children is a bit weirder, and then the second trilogy is much weirder, so it's less accessible. But Dune from the 60s, very, very good. Lovecraft, 20s and 30s. So that is 15-ish books, along with some honourable mentions and some bits and pieces. that you might enjoy in terms of classic sci-fi. If you have other recommendations for this, put them in the comments for others to read, and I'll see you next time.